We left off last class talking about mercantilism following the French and Indian War and how the British government under Prime Minister Grenville wanted to raise money by exporting more than it imported in order to pay off the debt from protecting the colonists in the New World. And all of this is part of the conversation is what is the role of the colonies and the mother country? In theory, the colonies should produce wealth for the mother country. But as we start to see in the 13 colonies, they resent that because they feel that they're being treated differently than other British citizens. So pretty soon after the end of the French and Indian War, there is going to be a whole group of new laws and acts intended in raising revenue for the government. We have the Currency Act, which takes away paper money in the colonies. You used to be able to use paper currency as legal tender, but in 1764, when that capability is removed, it means that the colonists must use hard currency. They must use coins in order to transact any trade. And this then forces people and companies to trade with England, therefore paying the import taxes or import duties. But many people wanted to get away from having to pay those import taxes, and so the government passes the Revenue Act. The purpose of this is to give customs officials who are at the harbor more power and more of a right to inspect the boats in order to find goods that must have duties or taxes paid. For a very long time, the colonists had been able to kind of avoid actually paying some of these taxes because as long as they were accomplishing what the mother country needed, they could get away with just about anything. But now that England is in debt, the rules are going to be enforced. Also in 1764, we have the Sugar Act, and the purpose of this is to stop sugar being imported from French colonies in the Caribbean. That could be sold at a much lower price because it wasn't subject to the British import duties. Now, the tax is actually lowered on sugar, but the difference is that now with the Revenue Act, with greater power to the customs officials, while the tax is lower, the tax will be enforced. The results of all of this is that the colonists are a bit upset and smuggling becomes much more prevalent, trying to avoid having to pay these charges by sneaking products into the country. And because of this, Great Britain makes it a capital crime, so a much more serious crime with much more severe punishments to be a smuggler. Then the following year, 1765, possibly the most famous of the different royal laws passed in this era is the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was passed in March of 1765 and wouldn't go into action until November. And there's a few reasons why the Stamp Act is passed. One is for the British government to assert its sovereignty over the colonists. Another thing is that it would be a direct tax. So rather than taxing a few goods that are coming in, and that money would be paid by the company or be paid by the shipper. The Stamp Act is a direct tax because the end consumer is going to pay this tax. What would happen is that there would be many items which would not be allowed to be sold without this royal stamp or this royal seal. And this was seen as a great way of raising money because it could affect just about everyone in the colony. It would be lots of paper goods, so newspapers, and many people read newspapers, playing cards, legal documents, elements that would impact just about every element of society. So this is being passed on to the end consumer. And because all of the colonies are being impacted, this is going to be an event that unites the different parts of the colonies. We have talked about how culturally, economically, there were many differences. but most of the colonists are going to resent this new tax. So even before it goes into action, colonists are protesting in various ways. One of the protest groups that is created is called the Sons of Liberty. One of the founding members is Samuel Adams up in Boston. And he's a great example of people who joined the Sons of Liberty. He was sort of a tradesman. He wasn't a beer brewer, but he was involved in the beer brewing process. And the people who joined the Sons of Liberty often were shopkeepers, people who would be hurt by these new taxes in the Stamp Act. Because if all of these products that people would buy would now cost more, people are going to stop buying things. And so these people's businesses were at risk. We also have further south, we have Patrick Henry, who was a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, so he's a member of that elected assembly. He believed that this is showing the tyranny of the British government, and he said that there should be no taxation without representation. So that Parliament is passing laws, but there are no members of Parliament that are representing the interests of the colonists. Something that Sons of Liberty become known for are Liberty trees, which would be sort of in town squares. And this would be a central location for meetings where they would hold protests. They might hang up mannequins or effigies of people that they were angry with. Some towns had a liberty tree, others had a liberty pole. And when this cap, the Phrygian cap, which is a symbol from ancient Rome, when the cap would be put on the pole, it would be a symbol to all the members that a sort of a club meeting was imminent. And while this Stamp Act still has not been enacted, it is still months away, the colonists are so upset that they act. So they are going to meet at the Stamp Act Congress. Massachusetts suggests that there be a meeting of all of the different colonies to discuss this issue of Parliament creating laws versus the local colonial assemblies creating laws. They meet in New York City simply because it's centrally located. And the main argument is there has not been a direct tax before this, so why is there one now? And they suggest that a boycott be started the day before this act goes into effect. And this is important because a boycott is a legal way of protesting. A boycott is when you refuse to buy products in order to send a message economically that you do not like something, that you are displeased. So again, the main result of the Stamp Act Congress is agreement on a boycott of British products, and pretty much all of the colonies agree to do this. So this is their way of legally, peacefully protesting. The Declaratory Act is in place of the Stamp Act. After just a few months, the British government found how damaging these boycotts were to their economy. So they passed the Declaratory Act, which removes the Stamp Act, but also declares that the King and Parliament are sovereign, that their will is supreme. And the actual wording of the act says it's an act for the better securing the dependency of His Majesty's dominions in America upon the Crown and Parliament of Great Britain. So Parliament and the King are saying we are in control. However, the colonists are so happy to no longer have the Stamp Act that they don't fully understand the rest of the law. They don't understand how potentially damaging this will ultimately be. The following year, we have a whole group of acts called the Townshend Acts. These are named after the head of the Treasury. In Britain, it's called the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And the whole purpose of these acts is to, again, raise money to continue fixing the debt that Great Britain saw as a result of protecting the colonists in the French and Indian War. The Townshend Act creates taxes on all sorts of goods like paper, glass, tea, paint, things that were everyday objects. And again, the colonists are not happy about this. They ultimately end up harassing, bullying customs officials. And not really technically one of the Townshend Acts, but considered at the same time, is the Quartering Act. The Quartering Act says that local towns must make provision for the housing or the quartering of the British military units. Now, this is not saying that they must be housed in civilian homes, but empty barns, town halls, they can be taken over by the army in order for housing. So we see that more soldiers are being brought in to help protect the customs officials who are getting harassed over these new taxes on paper and lead and glass and paint and tea. So we're starting to see a bit more conflict. In response to the Townshend Acts, a man by the name of John Dickinson writes letters from a Pennsylvania farmer. And he is arguing in this series of pamphlets that the colonists need to unite against the Townshend Acts, that they need to show their displeasure towards the British government. And again, all of this going back to no taxation without representation. So, a few years after the Stamp Act, a new boycott is suggested, and the purpose is again to forego British goods so as to not give the British government the taxes on these products. And one of the most visible results of this is a fabric called homespun. Rather than buying fabric that would be imported by the British, people started making their own fabric. It was rougher, it was thicker, it was less comfortable. But this was showing how much the people did not want to be subject to these new taxes. For business owners that did not want to partake in the boycott, the Sons of Liberty would often enforce it. So they would harass, sometimes they would tar and feather businessmen who did not want to go along with the boycott. In this sense, the Sons of Liberty are getting a bit more violent, becoming a bit more mob-ish in organization. Another thing that will result from this boycott is an increase in smuggling. And one of our founding fathers, John Hancock, he made his money through smuggling. So some people are really going to benefit. The colonists are going to be able to get the products that they want and need, but it is doing it by skirting the law. We are definitely seeing that the people want to be represented. They don't want a parliament that has no direct connection to them. So they want direct representation rather than what we would call virtual representation. Throughout the boycott, again, the Sons of Liberty enforcing with civilians, but also we still have sort of harassment of government officials like the customs officials. And so the governor of Massachusetts asks to have more soldiers brought into Boston. Now, 4,000 soldiers are brought in, so it's a bit of overkill. And there's not enough work, there's not enough protecting for 4,000 soldiers. So they end up being kind of bored. Their interactions with colonists are not always positive. And the civilians aren't helping things either. They are often taunting or sort of bullying the soldiers, but the soldiers have orders not to respond. And that's the case in March of 1770. Civilians were throwing snowballs at the British soldiers. The soldiers had orders not to fire. And we don't know who, but someone fired, and ultimately 5 people were killed. And it's called the Boston Massacre. I mean, 5 people probably is not an accurate name for 5 people. But this is really a press stunt where the colonists are showing, or they are portraying the British as vicious. But these soldiers were only following orders, and they were trying not to engage with the colonists. John Adams is the lawyer who defends them in court, and most of them are found not guilty. But it really was too little too late, because the British now really are seen as these brutal colonial masters. And this will only continue as more events happen, as the government passes more laws, and the colonists resent it even more.